The scuffle between Germany's Interior Minister and Chancellor Angela Merkel seems to be finally over because they have reached an agreement on whether or not to turn away migrants, some of whom may be Africans, at the borders. Thomas Sparrow answers questions as to how this new arrangement will work, starting from exactly what the details of the agreement are.
Well, Gifty, you and I have spoken on various occasions about the problems between Angela Merkel from the CDU, that's her Conservative Party, and Horst Seehofer, the Interior Minister, who comes from Angela Merkel's sister party in Bavaria, the CSU. And the biggest problem there has been obviously all the migration issue. This is not necessarily new. They've had plenty of problems since the refugee crisis in 2015. But obviously in this latest episode of that crisis, it's all about trying to make sure that the borders are in a way better protected, that the borders are in a way more secure, and that migrants, especially migrants who have registered in other EU countries, are then not allowed into Germany. And the agreement that they reach precisely contemplates this. They're talking about a new border regime, and I'd like to quote what they say, that prevents asylum seekers whose asylum procedures are the responsibility of other EU countries from entering the country. They plan to do that with a series of measures, including what they described as transit centers, in other words, centers where they can determine at the border who has already been registered in other country and therefore has to be sent back, and who isn't registered in another country and then can go forward with his asylum or her asylum application. They also want to do it with bilateral or multilateral agreements with obviously other EU countries where the migrants registered first. And it's important to sort of indicate what the rule here is so far at an EU level, because up to now the country responsible for the application of an asylum seeker is the country where that specific asylum seeker arrived first. And what EU leaders, and in particular German leaders, want to make sure that they can control is that those migrants simply do not start traveling around the European Union after registering in one specific country.
So finally, it looks as if a part of what the Interior Minister wants is happening. What would you call this? A win for the Interior Minister, or a win for Angela Merkel, or basically a win-win situation?
Well, they have all obviously tried to describe this in favorable terms for their own specific interests. So Angela Merkel saying, for example, that she achieved a deal at the EU level and also managed obviously to prevent a larger crisis here in the government. The Interior Minister saying basically that the proposals by him and by his party were those that ultimately prevailed both nationally and at an EU level. The far-right Alternative for Germany, the main opposition party, saying that they've been asking for these kinds of measures for a long time now, so they've obviously all tried to present that in a positive light for their own interests. However, there's another way of looking at these issues, and that way is saying that the German government, and in particular the German coalition, is weak, that Angela Merkel has had a lot of problems obviously with her coalition, in particular with the Bavarian CSU, and that the deals agreed both nationally and then at an EU level are vague and still lack obviously a lot of content and a lot of information. So there are different ways of approaching this. The politicians themselves obviously trying to present it in a positive light for themselves, but there are many critical opinions here about what was achieved and whether this is definitely the end of a very difficult period in German politics.
And also a very difficult period as well for migrants who are seeking, some of whom are genuinely seeking refuge. But Thomas, how soon does this take effect, and how specifically will it work?
Well, that is, Gifty, the main problem, that we don't know many details so far, neither at the EU level, and we discussed last week, for example, that many of those issues could be on a voluntary basis, nor at a national level. We only know those details that I mentioned. Those things now have to be decided, and there's an absolutely fundamental issue here. We're not only talking about the Conservative bloc, in other words, Angela Merkel's party and the Interior Minister's party in the German coalition. There's a third party involved, the Social Democrats. We've also spoken on various occasions here about the Social Democrats. Obviously now they have to decide whether they approve this deal by the Conservatives, and in the past they have been incredibly critical of these so-called transit centers, or of other types of centers where they could keep migrants. So it's still an open question, and a big open question in fact, whether the Social Democrats will also approve what was agreed by the Interior Minister and by Chancellor Merkel. So there is still no concrete date. For now, the only thing that Germans have is that sort of very vague agreement and the fact that at least there's some sort of common ground, even if that common ground is still lacking all those details.
You've spoken about how the politicians are sharing this so-called victory among themselves. What has the reaction been from among EU countries and among Germans?
Well, obviously skepticism in many EU countries as well. They believe obviously that that decision in Germany could then trigger some sort of domino effect in Europe. For example, we've heard words from Austria saying that now they have to look and see whether that deal here in Germany will affect them in any way, because obviously we're talking about the German-Austrian border in particular, and then obviously other countries as well still analyzing, as well as the European Commission analyzing the German deal to see what the impact will be. So that is obviously very general as far as the EU is concerned. As far as Germans are concerned, there's probably nothing that Germans value more than stability. Germans are not necessarily known for wanting radical change. So in a way, obviously, I guess Germans see this agreement favorably, at least when it comes to preventing a bigger crisis in Germany, at least when it comes to preventing a collapse in the German government. And many Germans as well, from previous surveys that we've seen and that we've read, are in favor of a more restrictive policy towards migration. That's something that we've seen on various occasions as well in different polls. So I guess many will favor this agreement as well, though again there are still only very few details. There are polls that will come in the next few days. We know that already, asking some of these important questions. So only then will we be able to find out exactly what Germans think about this specific deal. But from what we know so far, I guess Germans do value the fact that the coalition is still together, even though it's weak, that there wasn't a collapse of the government, that the government is still in a way working, and that they have policies in place that at least some Germans do view favorably.
Thomas, thank you very much for the update and the analysis there. Thomas Sparrow is political correspondent with our partners, DW. He joined us all the way from Germany like we do every Wednesday. You're still watching The Pulse with me, Gifty, and Doapia.